Just give it a few more seconds here. Thank you for joining us today. All right, I am going to get started. All right, let's start this party. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for our conversation about building anti-racist practices for recruitment, hiring, and retention. This is a part of the Transforming Silence into Action series designed by Jodi-Ann Burey. This is session 2 of a 3-part series presented by the University of Washington's Communication Leadership Graduate Program and Simplicity Consulting. I'm Lisa Heffert. Hello, I'm founder and CEO of Simplicity Consulting. We provide enterprise marketing services to large corporations here in the Pacific Northwest. And our mission is to help everyone thrive in the new world of work, and that includes ongoing learning and development. We're thrilled to partner with the University of Washington and Jodi-Ann to have these important conversations. Our shared goal is to create a learning space to build inclusive professional practices and culture at work. While our focus is on communication and marketing professionals, these workshops are for the public and everyone is welcome. Each of us has a role to play, and it will take all of us to make global change a reality. This is the beginning of an ongoing conversation, and I'm so excited to get started. Before we dive into today's presentation and conversation, I'd like to cover a few orientation matters. First, be mindful that today's webinar is being recorded for our records. The recording will not be available to you in its entirety after the webinar, but your questions and responses may shape future presentations on the subject. Speaking of questions and responses, we encourage you to use the chat function, which you're already using in Zoom, to engage with the content and the other attendees. Also, if you have questions for Jodi-Ann or one of the speakers, please use the Q&A. We have interpreters for the hearing impaired, so please be sure you are in gallery view. That's gallery view, so you can see the interpreter. And if you need technical assistance, please chat directly with Sarah Keats. Now, we're excited to listen, learn, and take action. I'd like to introduce you to Jodi-Ann Burey, speaker, writer, and equity advocate, who will facilitate today's conversation. You can learn more about Jodi-Ann at jodiannburey.com. Thank you very much, and take it away, Jodi-Ann.
Thank you so much, Lisa. As Lisa said, my name is Jodi-Ann. I'm a speaker, I'm a writer, I'm an equity advocate. If you want to learn about me and my projects, find me on the internet. I have a Googleable or Bingable name. Find my website, LinkedIn, Instagram, and connect with me. But today is not about me at all. It's about you. It's about all of you, all of us, and how we can transform our individual and collective silence. Our silence, right? The values that we hold, but we don't really talk about it. You know, the issues that we say we care about, but don't take enough time to learn more. The inaction and the silence we demonstrate when pushback comes our way, that silence. How can we not change, but transform this silence into action in our everyday lives at work? And particularly for the marketing and communication folks in the room, how do you transform your silence into finding new narratives in your work that can drive our organizations, our companies, our communities, and our culture towards the vision of racial equity in our lifetimes? And so this idea of transforming silence into action comes from the late, great poet, Audre Lorde. And I want to hold space for Audre Lorde, who died of breast cancer, particularly as Breast Cancer Awareness Month comes up in a few weeks. And so her essay, Transforming Silence into Language and Action, was written less than 2 months after she had her breast cancer diagnosis. And it grounds our approach today. And so I want to read a few of her words. In this particular essay, she writes, "We can learn to work and speak when we are afraid in the same way that we have learned to work and speak when we are tired. For we have been socialized to respect fear more than our own need for language and definition. And while we wait in silence for that final luxury of fearlessness, the weight of that silence will choke us. The fact that we are here and that I speak these words is an attempt to break that silence and bridge some of those differences between us. For it is not difference which immobilizes us, but silence. And there are so many silences to be broken. And in this essay, Audre Lorde, separate from this excerpt, she writes, and this is a phrase that I think many people have come to know in some way. But in this essay, she writes, "Your silence will not protect you." And I'm so thrilled for our lineup of speakers today who in their careers have broken through the silence of racial inequities in the talent pipeline development. Through their expertise today, let their words, their language, and their action be the catalyst for your own transformation. To break through the myths of challenges and inspire you to see new opportunities in recruiting, hiring, and retaining talent of color, and creating inclusive, equitable workplace cultures for them to thrive. And so here's what you can expect today. Each of our speakers will lay out their ideas, mindsets, and approaches to these uninterrupted presentations. And so the best way for you to get the most out of their presentations is to take notes. I have, I'm old school, so I go analog sometimes, but take paper notes, open up a new tab on another screen, be present. Be present in this work. Don't get caught up in whether recordings are going to be shared or the presentation is going to be shared. Be present and get your questions ready for the Q&A, and then also the questions ready for yourself. And so speaking of Q&A, after our speakers present, I will then bring them all back for a panel discussion. And I have my list of questions here ready for them, but feel free to put your questions in the chat, and I'm monitoring the chat too. And so there might be things that you're speaking to that are takeaways for you that I might use to change my own questions. And so if I don't address your questions in my session, please use the Q&A feature in this setup here in Zoom to put your questions in, because then we'll have another section that's just audience Q&A. And so I know there's still some conversations here about the interpreters, and we want to make sure that all of that is set and ready to go. So I'm just gonna go a little bit slower to see if we can get that sorted out. But another thing that I want to invite people to remember is that the chat is a community space. And so get in the chats. I come from a call and response tradition. You say something, I say something back, and that's how we create a communication community with each other. I want you to use the chat in that way. If someone says something that you're like, heck yes, write heck yes. Let the over 500 people are in this space right now. Put that heck yes there, right? If there are questions that you have, put it in the chat. If there are takeaways that you have, put that in the chat, because other people are seeing the chat too. And so maybe your moment of an aha is, someone else's aha potentially, or maybe something that they missed. And so we're in a collective learning environment, a collective teaching environment. And so let the space be that. I will be monitoring the chat. We want to be in a space of positivity. We want to be in a space of learning and affirmation. If there are things that make you feel defensive, hold that. Things that make you uncomfortable become your own learning map of work that you have to do later. I don't want to see in the chat, some contention around these ideas. I want to see in the chat how we can go deeper into these ideas. And so with all of that said, let us get the first speaker up. Jennifer, if you want to get your slides ready. I know I've seen a couple of folks that are raising hands. We're not going to address raising hands in this session until we get to the Q&A portion of this. So as we get set up for Jennifer, I want to introduce her. So Jennifer Kim is a startup advisor and a diversity and inclusion strategist for top startups in Silicon Valley and beyond. Previously, Jennifer was the head of people at Lever, a startup known for reaching rare diversity milestones via a unique grassroots strategy rooted in authenticity. I cannot wait for her talk. Her diversity work is accessible at Inclusion at Work. It's an advice column for startups. She has a Udemy course, and her Twitter account is apparently the place to be. This is why I need to start engaging with Twitter a little bit more, because I'm missing all this good stuff. And so let's see some excitement, some welcoming in the chat for Jennifer to get started.
Hello, everybody. Let me go ahead and share my screen, but I just first want to say thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for taking the time. Special thanks to the team here. Lots of coordination, lots of back-end work that goes into organizing events like this. And so far, I'm super grateful and been so impressed so far. Okay, so today my portion will be talking about how to market diversity in an authentic way. So I'm coming from, like I mentioned, Jodi mentioned for me, the land of Silicon Valley, the land of startups. And even if you aren't coming from that tech environment yourself, I think I have a few lessons that I'm really happy to share. But first I want to start with, oh, there we go. If y'all have seen Silicon Valley, the show, the HBO show, where I actually get asked a lot, like, oh, you know, is it really like that? Like living in San Francisco, working in tech? And the answer is yes. And it's very disturbing how actually, you know, art imitates life, how scary similar it can be. So you might have heard that Silicon Valley, tech are industries that are traditionally extremely very homogeneous, very white, very male. And on the right-hand side here, we do have some real images of startups. And this is actually what most startups look like. In fact, the startup that I joined as employee number 6, I was the first female employee. The team was entirely white and Asian. And I remember having come from an education nonprofit space, I was not used to this. So I actually asked the engineers in my first few weeks, like, oh, is this kind of normal? Is this kind of like lack of diversity, like typical? And the poor engineers, they kind of looked at me blankly and they were like, what are you talking about? Because for them, it was so typical. Really fun space to work in for sure. The lessons I want to bring up here, though, are even though this is in tech, diversity wasn't the norm, I had the kind of privilege and the position being such an early employee, like, well, what can we do to make sure we build the best team possible, which means taking into account all kinds of different perspectives, people from different backgrounds, so we can really break out of the norm. So I ended up building a startup that over 3 years and about 100 employees later became extremely well known for diversity. We had, for example, 50% of employees that were identifying as women and non-binary. We had very significant representation of LGBTQ, Black and Latinx, employees who were parents and caregivers, to the point that I remember one Black engineer had come in to interview with us when we were about 50 employees. And he was really surprised because when we came in to interview, there was another Black man there. He was like, I've never seen this at a small startup. And he was so surprised when he actually joined and found out there were 3 other Black men at the time. So a lot of people were saying, like, I didn't even know this was possible. I didn't think this existed. And there's lots of stories and, lessons I really want to share with you because I took a lot of work. I have a lot of battle scars, a lot of gray hairs I can show you individually. But today, what I want to talk to you about is this intersection of recruiting, marketing, and diversity. When Jodi and I were initially talking about this session and I understood that, you know, a lot of this audience is coming from a marketing background, I thought about where I see as kind of the #1 trap, the opportunity for the intersection of these spaces where we can really lean into what does it mean to talk about and show diversity in an authentic way, especially when you're talking in the recruiting context. So let me show you some lessons there, and I want to teach you about some concepts as well. So do a quick exercise with me. Let's say you are on Instagram, I know most of us are, and you see an image like this. You're like, wow, you know, I'm scrolling. You're like, this is so beautiful. I wish I was on the beach somewhere instead of quarantine in my house. And it kind of makes you maybe like compare, like, why am I not sitting there? I wish my life was like this. This is kind of like the Instagram effect. But really what happens when you zoom out is something like this. Because on the left here, images like this actually take a ton of work to create. And often, honestly, we're faking it. I'm not even saying this is necessarily a bad or good thing, because for a lot of us who are in marketing, our jobs are to kind of present the most flattering or the best, pull out the best stories. I think the problem though is when, this is what I call the Instagram effect, when we're so used to this kind of comparison and showing our highlight reels to the world and not necessarily like our most authentic or what's going on, it really kind of changes our minds to what we should be doing. We start to look for, maybe our behavior start changing towards what looks good versus what you actually enjoy. So an example might be, you know, that the next time you're going to brunch, minus quarantine, instead of thinking about, okay, where do I enjoy the most food? Where will I, you know, kind of have the best experience with my friends and family? It's more like, which restaurant has the best aesthetics so I can get the best picture? And my real reward is the Instagram likes I get, not the experience itself. So once again, I'm not saying this is necessarily a good or bad thing, but it is something to be aware of, the Instagram effect of how it kind of changes our behavior over time. I want to liken this to kind of the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, because as someone who works with a lot of companies on DEI in the last few years, I see kind of two common patterns of very strong emotions. So on kind of usually the company leaders and HR and managers, there's a lot of anxiety and desperation, right? Like, oh my gosh, everything we're doing is wrong. What's everybody else doing? Like, we're afraid of making any missteps. On the right-hand side, I see what's really common in people of color, other underrepresented groups, where there's a lot of actually frustration and anger. It feels like things are not really moving. It feels like lip service. Am I just here as a token? And I liken this because the Instagram effect leads us to think how when we see other companies talking about diversity, we're only seeing their highlight reels. We usually have only access to kind of what's happening within our four walls. And let me tell you, as someone who talks to companies all day long about their diversity efforts, everyone is struggling. But we're also comparing our internal efforts to everybody else's publicly visible efforts and really getting down on ourselves. And unfortunately, leads to a little bit of what I call performative diversity. So let's look at some more visual examples. This is an image from a couple of years ago. It's a sandwich, a rainbow-themed sandwich, LGBT, and it was released for Pride Month, which is in June in the United States. Look, on one hand, so this is a little bit of a mixed message, because mixed feelings for me, because on one hand, the fact that we can actually acknowledge and have artifacts like this is a really big deal. It's a big sign of progress. I'm being really generous here. The fact that we can talk about LGBTQ communities in a way that maybe in a few years ago, we couldn't even have this sandwich. It would have been too controversial. However, it also makes me think about, who does this sandwich really serve? When we do things like this, is it really rooted in the needs of the LGBTQ community? And this can be really confusing and even conflicting, because now we're seeing kind of this like every June rainbow washing like it's a competition. Like, did you even know you could get rainbow vodka or Doritos? And it's these surface level celebrations that I think unfortunately are kind of masking the ongoing struggles faced by the LGBTQ community today. How do all these celebrations and campaigns are ultimately benefiting, let's say, queer and trans people? I think this is the result of maybe when we're kind of pressing the panic button in reaction to everything that's going on. So in bringing this to recruitment, let's look at an example of a careers page. I think every company I've talked to in the last couple of years has been thinking really carefully about careers page, because if you're recruiting, that is one of the most impactful things you can work on. But it's a little bit of a chicken or the egg problem. Let's say your company doesn't have a lot of diversity now, but you really do want to attract more, hire more underrepresented candidates. So what happens very unfortunately often is that, you kind of pick out your 3, Black employees and your 2 women from your engineering team, splash them on the front page. And let's say someone from an underrepresented group sees your website and says like, oh, okay, they seem to like really care about diversity. Let me go in there and apply. They go for the interviews, not realizing that maybe 98% of the company is actually white. And they find that out on the first day. So once again, we have to ask the question, who was this really for? When maybe the candidate or the employee now feels like they were kind of tricked. They had a bait and switch moment, and now they're just like, I guess I'm sticking out with this job, but it's kind of starting out with a little bit of a lie. Once again, I'm showing that this is kind of a nuanced point, because I'm not even saying you should never, highlight diversity on your team, because there has to be a way to do it more authentically than in a way that actually causes further harm to people that we're trying to actually serve. So a recent example of this, y'all might remember the Blackout Tuesday, and this was following the George Floyd's death. There was a social media campaign where a lot of people were saying, oh, for one day I will not post, and I will instead post a black square. Once again, maybe good intentions, but what the unintended effect that this had, and a lot of activists are actually very upset about this for very good reason. This campaign ended up blocking out a lot of the really helpful activism, community resources were being shared under that tag. So by a ton of these people posting these things, you were actually blocking people's access to information about safety and community action. There are a lot of things that we're just not thinking very critically about. The thing that I want you to remember is that successful diversity efforts are going to center the needs and voices of marginalized groups. This is something that we all have to get in the habit of. The next time your company wants to do a diversity, some kind of related marketing effort, really asking the question, why are we doing this? What's our motivation? Who is this serving? And what are maybe some unintended impact on the underrepresented communities? And if we're not willing to ask those questions and we're getting defensive or, this is too hard for us, we need to really examine from our position of power, should we be doing this at all? Are there better ways? Are there more direct ways to be impactful? This is something that I feel like we haven't been paying attention until recently, but there's a lot of opportunity here to really go more in depth and become a lot more sophisticated in our DEI efforts. Speaking of authenticity and centering, marginalized voices and needs, I think something that, I really have so many ideas I'm excited to share, and I'll include some of the links in a second, but telling authentic stories is actually what marketers do best. So I highly encourage you to not just think about what looks good, but maybe how can you help people from underrepresented groups to really share their stories in a way that can reach others. So something I did at my previous company was run an employee blog that really spotlighted employees who wanted to share their stories. So whether it was about, Black LGBTQ male employee who had been horribly discriminated against in his previous jobs. And he talked about his journey and his discovery. And we had another engineer who talked about why this matters for him. And that's exactly what you can do to leverage your skills to help people tell authentic stories. Jodi mentioned that I run a blog, and I highly recommend you check it out, because that's where we also try to provide a platform for telling authentic stories as well. We collect anonymous stories about what mistakes are being made behind the scenes, peeling back the layers of the Instagram effect. What does it feel like to kind of be like an imposter? And I don't know what I'm doing. What if I see the wrong thing? All of these things are normal. Everybody's on a journey. And there's this one post that I think everybody here would like, which is, how do you do diversity marketing that doesn't suck? How do you actually show diversity when you don't have it? I hope you ever check that Otherwise, for continued learning, you can check out my website under the inclusion section, where I have a ton of resources. I've helped write a book on hiring, so there's a lot of tactics we can go into. I've tried to put as many of them into possible in this free chapter that's available online. And I teach a Udemy course for people who want to build a MVP kind of grassroots program in their companies as well. So that's time for me. I will stick around for more questions, but thank you so much for your time and excited for the rest of the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Oh my God, I put my hair up, but I forgot I was coming back on camera. Anyway, what I love about your presentation, Jennifer, is it's asking us to ask ourselves some real questions, right? What are we trying to say about our companies, our organizations? How can we do so in an authentic way? And whose needs are we centering? And so what I'm super excited to dig into when we get into our Q&A is, what if your authentic story isn't that great, right? What if your employees of color are not really having a good time? And so how do we think about looking at the culture so we can actually tell, more authentic stories about who we are, again, centering the needs of those who have been marginalized or underrepresented. And so thank you so much for that. Again, I love what's happening in the chat. I can't wait until y'all engage with Krystal. So our next speaker is Krystal Tomsick. She is the Vice President of Equity and Belonging at Zillow. Krystal leads the teams driving the company's initiatives around diversity and inclusion, cultural engagement, and social impact. She has nearly 2 decades of experience in building the organizational structures and workplace plans aimed at helping companies represent communities in which they do business and strengthening those communities in the process. Krystal has previously led several functions within Zillow's people organization, including the operations team, the recruiting programs, and the centralized recruiting teams. Prior to Zillow, she built her career in program management, analytics, recruiting, and social responsibility at large companies, including Target and Expedia. All of her work has been focused around diversifying the workforce to represent the communities in which they do business and to strengthen those communities. I will also say, Krystal interviewed me once when I was interviewing at Zillow. I did not get that job, but Krystal was amazing. I so enjoyed my interview with her. And so with that, take it away, Krystal.
And Jodi-Ann, you got a fan for life, obviously. When you called me for this, my response was like, tomorrow? When do we do this? How do we get on the phone? Thank you for that warm welcome. And thank you, Jennifer, for those tips. I think you're going to hear some consistent themes from Jennifer, myself, and Kelli. And I want you to look out for those, right? I want you to look for what we say that's different. I want you to look for what we say that's similar as you're taking your own notes and what resonates with you. Because some of you, from my understanding, are sitting in this position where you're marketing professionals now, or you're aspiring marketing professionals now. Some of you are in that recruitment or retention space, and some of you might be coming from the perspective of yourself, right? As being a person of color, an employee of color, or an ally, and trying to navigate through the corporate world in this very specific time where we're all essentially waking up to what it means to be anti-racist. So I want to walk through those different components, what it's like right now to be from the company side, what it's like right now to be from the individual. But I'll start a little bit more with my background. It's been a journey. I am one of those people, if any of you can relate, I'd love to see it in the chat, but I did not know what I wanted to be when I grew up. I went to school for design, which only manifests now in me picking wallpaper and this bow on my dress. I've done nothing with design since I graduated college. I was fortunate enough, though, to get a 4-year degree, and I got an interesting lesson in what it's like to have that privilege of a piece of paper when it truly had nothing to do with the jobs that I was going after. But I started in nonprofit because I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had a big heart, right? You've got that feeling of, I want to do good, let me go to a nonprofit. Unfortunately, I'm from right outside of Washington, D.C. And unfortunately for me, that nonprofit, this was 20 years ago at the time, was supposed to be helping students and young adults with disabilities learn a trade, learn the arts, but instead it was pocketing money and it was pocketing opportunity. And so I learned a pretty big lesson early on what kind of company do you want to work for? Who do you want to be? What type of legacy do you want to serve? But I didn't learn that overnight. I then went and worked in a warehouse at night just to make some money, and then was fortunate enough to transfer to corporate. So I was in a Target warehouse in the middle of nowhere in Virginia, and that's when I got a real dose. I think I'm 22 at the time. I got a real dose of, you've been in a bubble in Washington, D.C., where everybody was from somewhere, some country, some background, so you're not special, to you've moved down to Southern Virginia in this one little valley at the time, in this one distribution center, where my team members self-segregated by race in the cafeteria, where my biggest focus was keeping the women on my team safe from their husbands who worked in the same building. Like, that was my reality for the time that I was in that distribution center of what is it like to really just cut away the bullshit. Jodi-Ann, am I allowed to swear a little bit? I'll swear a little bit.
Go for it.
Okay, to cut away the bullshit and to really focus on the health, well-being, safety, and advancement of your team members. And for me to break that bubble of what I thought it was like to be a person of color in a city, coming from a place of privilege, being in that spot, to what it was like to be a person of color in an area of the state where most of my team members didn't have a high school diploma, let alone the college diploma that I had been fortunate enough to get. And so I carried those lessons with me in my career. I transferred to corporate. I was really, really lucky to have a really strong internal mobility recruiter take pity on me and help guide me. If that person hadn't helped me, I certainly wouldn't be where I am today. But I went to Target Corporation because they had this great big program where I could test into it, and I really learned a lesson about transferable skills. They put me in an analyst role. I had no business being in an analyst role, but they saw my ability to public speak, for empathy, and they taught me the rest. And so we're going to talk about transferable skills a little bit later and how important that is when you're looking for an employer and when you're looking for highlights from an employer. And then I made my way through there into HR about 10 years ago. I joined HR because I learned that, I wanted to help people understand how powerful they could be, and I could do that for a living. And that within itself is a gift to be able to even know where you want to focus your time. Got into recruiting, spent 10 years in recruiting and focusing on building practices in diversity that are ethical, authentic, and measurable. Do you take away it's the right thing to do to this is how you do it. It's not about the warm fuzzy. It's not about the feel good. It's about how do you lift up a community in a meaningful way? And so you need to do it in a way that is part of your business and is measurable. So bringing that project management and analytics into recruiting. And then I've been fortunate to be in this space of focusing specifically on belonging just since April was Zillow Group. And so I call it, in the time frame for me, I call it post-COVID, pre-George Floyd is when I stepped into this role of Vice President of Equity and Belonging. This is how I measure time right now. I don't know if anybody else is measuring time this way. But I feel very fortunate to be in this moment and this accumulation of all of my experiences here. So when you think about building anti-racist practices for recruitment, hiring, and retention, first of all, I want you to think about it that way. I want you to think about it as hiring and retention together. So for those people that are on the call who are in the business of hiring and retention, I'm going to speak to you first. So we're going to get to our marketing folks, then we're going to get to our individuals. It's important to, when you're thinking about hiring and retention, to think about them hand in hand. Because if you're hiring people, kind of like the old stereotype of the used car salesman, and you're just trying to get them in the car, you got to get them in a car today. You're going to get them in the role. That is a waste of everyone's time. I mean, you're going to sell someone a lemon. You're going to sell someone something that's not authentic. And candidates are smarter than that these days. And if anyone feels like they don't know the way to see through that, again, I'm going to probably say bullshit a lot, send me a message and we will walk you through how to see right through that. The hiring experience has to be authentic. You have to show versus tell who you are. So Jennifer mentioned about like storytelling in the blog. You have to be able to find real examples of who the culture is, what the team is like, versus here's a glossy picture, right? And then the retention, you need to understand what the retention in the company is like and what the developmental opportunities are for you. And we're going to click a little bit more into that. But Jodi-Ann mentioned we cannot be silent, right? We cannot sit back and hope that everything works itself out. It's the same thing when you're thinking about hiring and retention. It's all about hiring and retention. It's all about intentionality, and it's all about responsibility. And so the quote that keeps going round and round and round in my head over the last 6 months is from Grace Lee Boggs, and I'm sure I have skipped a few words in it as I've been saying it over and over for the last few months. But think about her words here of, you cannot change a society unless you see yourself as belonging to it, and you see yourself as responsible for changing it, right? So you cannot change a society unless you see yourself as belonging to it, and you see yourself as responsible for it. If you're in a space where you're looking on social media and you're saying, oh, it's heartbreaking, everything that's happening right now is heartbreaking, but you don't see yourself as part of it, you don't see yourself as standing in it and responsible for it, you haven't gotten there yet. When we talk about anti-racist practices, it's about action. It's about responsibility. And so I'll give you a little bit of our journey here at Zillow Group. So when I joined 3 years ago at Zillow Group to be part of the recruiting team, it was explicitly to help us double our business but to making sure we did it, as Jodi-Ann read in my bio, while representing the communities in which we were doing business, because we were pivoting from being a tech company to being a home buying and selling company. And now we're at a pivot point again. I came into this role again in April. The murder of George Floyd happened right on the hinges of the murder of Breonna Taylor and the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, and then all of these other stories and issues that had been compiling over the years that we were aware of. And the light bulb that went off for us as a company was, Zillow is the company that I joined 3 years ago because of the incredible equity and belonging work that was already happening. To me, it was the pinnacle. It was I sought it out. I left a job that I loved and a global role that I loved to be part of the belonging efforts at Zillow. But there was something different that happened for us in May. And it was seeing that we were responsible. It was the responsibility piece. It wasn't just how do we make this a good place for our employees and do this as great HR work alongside all of our other work. It's how do we take responsibility for our employee experience, but also our industry experience. And that is the change. That is the light bulb that's gone off for us. And that is the work that we're doing now. And we have a lot of work to do because it was a light bulb that just went off. And so when you think about that responsibility, what resonated with me is that more people Google the word Zillow than Google the word real estate. So think about that position of power. If more people are Googling the word Zillow than the words real estate, do you think there's some responsibility there? Because I do. Because when that was shared with me, that resonated with me then we have to see ourselves as belonging to the systemic issues in the real estate industry. When you think about racism, the real estate industry is an atrocious example of systemic racism and redlining and the effects that continue to this day. You can read the book, The Color Law, and you can walk the cities and walk the red lines and see to this day the effects of redlining. Our economist put out just 2 months ago that Black people today are 2.2 times more likely to be declined for a mortgage today in 2020, which is the worst that it's been since the 90s. There is work that we need to be doing right now in our industry. And so the first thing I want you to be thinking about, for those of you, speaking to those of you who are marketing professionals or thinking about the company that you're representing or could represent, think about what is your power, what is proprietary to you in your industry, in your role. Certainly, I would like for Zillow to be out there doing everything that we possibly can, just boiling the ocean, putting our hands in everything. But we won't actually move anything forward if we are not intentional. But if we focus on our industry of real estate and the effects that took decades to create and will take decades to make better, and if we focus on our employees, then we have a real chance at measuring success over time. And so it's important that you be thinking about, whether you're an individual or you're with a company, what is our specific position of power and privilege that then we can endeavor to do something about. And then you have to build it into your business. So the journey that we're on now is we're in our 2021 planning. And the difference between, again, making this a nice thing to do for employees or an HR only thing versus this is what we believe as a company, is every single one of our businesses, as they're thinking about their 2021 plan, has to come up with how are they putting into action. Our tech team's thinking about our tech languages, the products that we're creating for social impact. Our mortgage team's thinking about the outreach that they do to teach finances to increase generational wealth. Our HR team thinking about what is the volunteerism, what is the activism, our corporate relations team thinking about our lobbyist in all 50 states, what are they doing from an activism standpoint? What are they doing to get involved in the local governments and the national governments, in the government, in the legislation that will help to break down some of these barriers and move this work forward. And the first step for us, the first step for me, I've got to tell you, because again, I had to calm myself down of wanting to do everything as a woman of color, as someone who's been in this space for 20 years and just had a lot of angst and energy to do more. I had to step back. You know, Jennifer mentioned the whole blackout Tuesday or whatever that was, that blackout day. And that was a real moment for me at Zillow Group, where we had just released our statement, racism has no home here. And at the time, we developed a progress begins at home messaging, because racism has no home here is nothing unless we actually say what we're doing about it. Racism has no home here can be a performative statement if you don't come back with, okay, now this is what we're actually doing about it, and the progress begins at home. But that moments passed, like that blackout Tuesday or whatever it was, where we made the decision not to participate in things like that because it just seemed too in the moment. And then there were moments for me where we would see other companies release, their beautiful marketing teams would release, like, they're doing this. So we did Juneteenth as a day of service. And it's something that I'm incredibly proud of, because we curated experiences for our employees to learn about Juneteenth, to learn about what was currently happening in 2020 in our country and advance their education. We did not say you can take this day as allies. If you weren't typically going to take this day off as a Black person, you don't just get it as a holiday to eat hot dogs and sleep in. You get it as a day to learn about the significance and to come back with what you learned. But then, you know, you can easily flip on the TV or your LinkedIn and you see such and such company said that they're going to give Juneteenth off forever. And you're getting all of this praise. And I'm not saying that that's not the right thing to do. Maybe it is. Maybe we'll go for that in the future. But there were many moments for me as a professional where I wanted to kind of scream at my computer. It's not about quantity right now and how do we pacify the moment. It's about how do we take the time to really educate ourselves, and so that we are fundamentally more prepared to be in these conversations. How do you take someone who shuts down when they hear the word privilege, or shuts down when you hear the word racism, give them the day off for a day and hope that that fixes it, right? Like, how do you actually take the time to be on that journey together? And so we had to build a baseline. And that baseline started with data. Since 2016, we've been sharing our data externally on if you go to our webpage, you can see. And you can see that even though we have an overall percentage of white employees that's 62%, and for a company that's traditionally tech, that's pretty good to have 38% of your employees be people of color. But when you dig in there, we've stayed consistent. We've moved from 3 to 5% of Black employees. We've moved from 5 to 7% of Latinx employees. Now, we did that while we doubled the company, but I'm not going to pretend like I'm happy with those results, right? It's about turning on the lights and saying, this is where we're struggling, or this is where we have more opportunity. We want to hold ourselves accountable. And so when we sat as an HR and marketing team in that room and came up with racism has no home here, we did it with the intention of, we're ready for the response of, okay, Zillow, if racism has no home here, what's next? And we're ready to be on that journey, hold ourselves accountable, hold ourselves to that honesty, set that baseline, share our data, and then make real commitments that then get really granular, that aren't sweeping statements of we want to have 50% women in leadership, or this percent increase of Black leaders in leadership, but getting more granular and saying, this is where we have the biggest gap for our Black leaders, for our women leaders, for our Latinx leaders, et cetera, and this is what we're doing about it. That granularity is important, because if you're like many organizations, you have more women in leadership in certain orgs, right? If you look at the HR org, there's oftentimes more women in leadership, but in the tech org, there's less. So it's important for us to talk granularly. And so when you're making your plans, think about, how do you get granular? How do you know your total addressable market? How do you meet the needs of that total addressable market? And then when you get back to that retention piece we talked about before, make sure that you get out of your own way and don't think that you've created enough of a safe space for all of your employees to feel whole. We're a 5,300 person company. We have 1,000 managers. That's a lot of opportunities to get it right. And I'm so proud of our culture, but it's a lot of opportunities to get it wrong as well. And so it's important to have tools where people can share anonymously and not fear retribution. It's important to have coaching tools. It's important to have opportunities where team members don't have the burden to opt in, where they can get the development without feeling like they have to lean in or raise their hand, right? Because leaning in and raising your hand is already a barrier. It's already something that comes from a position of privilege where you have that confidence. And so for the individuals, as we get into questions, I want you to really think about, know what's important to you. You know, I mentioned that in my journey, somewhere I figured out that I wanted to be able to help others understand how powerful they could be. Know what's important to you and ask those specific questions. You are competitive in the market right now. Companies are seeking out talent of color, and not just because you're talent of color, but because they understand that they have a gap, that they have a deficit, and that they have to take responsibility and do more. Remember that show versus tell. Remember that a company will show you who you are, who they are. If it's not easy to find, then maybe they're not at the maturity level right now for you to join. Maybe that's not the burden that you want to take on right now. Ask about how often you'll get feedback on the job. Understand the feedback culture, understand the management culture, the training, because that's the feedback that I get as an HR professional time and time again of great, we have all of these great programs, we have all of these great speakers, but I need to be able to connect in a different way for my manager. I'm not hearing from my manager. So understand what tools are there to set you up for success or not for success. And then find out the 3-year plan. Like we mentioned, there's general guidance, but we're in this moment in time. And for many of us, we won't know what's performative allyship for years and years to come. And so lean in lean into trust as you're hearing from organizations that they want to do more, but get specific. Say, okay, you say you want to do more. What's the 3-year plan? What's the 5-year plan? What does this look like? How are you baking this into your practices? How is it not just a moment in time? Because at least for me, as a person of color, I have a lot of understanding being in this space of where companies may have been before. But from this space on, I don't have a lot of leeway for you're still figuring it out. I need to know that you are thinking 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, et cetera, out, and not just about the moment. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Jodi-Ann.
Oh my gosh, my fingers were like moving so fast. That was so great. What I love about Zillow, why I even applied to work there. First of all, had no interest in tech. I don't know anything about real estate. I don't even know what escrow means, and I'm almost 35, you know? But what I learned about Zillow is how they showed up in the professional communities of color in Seattle. I saw Zillow everywhere when I went to, diversity and inclusion meetings or, Black professional meetings. Zillow showed up, and they showed up with dollars. Like some of the best food that I've ever been at a networking event was at an event sponsored by Zillow. And so I think, Krystal, what you're also speaking to here, which I love, is your brand identity. What is your brand doing? How are you leveraging your power for social justice, racial justice? And so it's not about what you're saying as a company. I see it. I see what Zillow is doing. Are they perfect? No, but I see them a heck of a lot more than I see other companies when it comes to building relationships with people of color and the work that you're doing. And so what's also great about what you're saying too is to shift that power dynamic. As a person of color, you know, sometimes I feel like I'm being made to feel that I should be grateful to even be in an interview with some company. But no, you should be grateful that I'm sitting here. I'm holding the power. Especially in this moment moving forward, you have the power to ask those questions. What is your plan? What are you doing? Because I want to be at a space where I belong. And I think that's the path for us as folks of color, is owning that power and being able to take some risks that maybe your dream company isn't where you want to be. And then for these companies that position themselves as being dream companies, how can you be the place that you want to be to attract and retain talent of color? And so thank you so much, Krystal, for that. I feel like I'm in church now. This is great. My mom would be happy because I haven't been to church in maybe 20 years. Anyway, so our next speaker is Kelli Mason. She's a partner at Notley, a social impact investing firm where she focuses on racial justice, both within companies and in the larger community. Kelli previously led people operations at 2 venture-backed startups, ran a national workplace inclusion consulting firm, I don't know if you've heard of it, it's called Paradigm, and practiced employee benefits and executive compensation law in Silicon Valley. She has a law degree, y'all. And so she's a graduate of Rice University, cum laude, and Stanford Law School. So I met Kelli in Austin. She is phenomenal, so amazing, an incredible leader, innovator, and just someone I love that's in my circle. The fact that I have her phone number just makes me so happy. And she's also a phenomenal writer. And so here is Kelli. Please, I want to see some love and excitement for Kelli in the chat. It's all you, Kelli.
Thank you so much. I also want to touch on something off script that you just brought up. It's not just people of color who want to be in companies that are diverse. It's also white people, right? Like all of the people on this call, I'm sure if you go to a job interview and everyone at the company is white, you're not going to be accepting that offer. So think about what's going through your head and then imagine how much more people of color are feeling that, or women are feeling that if they show up to an interview and they're the only woman. So anyway, I think it's important. It's not just us who are demanding diverse workforces these days.
Yeah, great point. Thank you for checking me on that. I appreciate that.
No, just adding on. So I'll hop into it. I know we are past our time, so I will try to go quickly without speaking too quickly. So talking about recruiting, hiring, retaining people, like Krystal touched on, a lot of companies just want to focus on the first part. They want to focus on recruiting. I see companies get so caught up in building diverse talent pools, reaching diverse candidates, but then we see them drop the ball when it comes to actually creating an inclusive hiring process. So all of the people that you brought in through the pipeline actually want to apply to your job. They actually want to accept an offer if they receive one. And then even more difficult, how are we retaining them, right, once they get through the process? But we don't think about that part. We just think about the pipeline. We just want a diverse pipeline, right? If you're an inclusion strategist, Jennifer, I know you've had companies who are like, just get me a diverse pipeline. But that's not it. So I want to share some thoughts on, as you're thinking about your DEI goals, you've got to remember to prioritize taking care of the people you already have. So recognize that just as hard as you and your hiring team are going out there trying to recruit every talented person of color in your industry, in your city, those talented people of color who are already at your company, they're also being hit up all the time from recruiters. I can tell you, LinkedIn message, I mean, it's popping, right? People are always sending messages. And so I know that there's people who are doing the same thing. And so if you're just focusing your efforts on recruiting people and you're not thinking about the employees that you already have, they're going to leave you more quickly than you're able to replace them anyway. So it's really important, lead with that. Secondly, and relatedly, recognize that people talk, especially people in marginalized groups. Like Jodi-Ann mentioned, I'm based in Austin. We only have 8% Black people. I know a lot of this audience is based in the Pacific Northwest. I don't know exactly your statistics, but I don't think you have a lot of Black people either. While we do not all know each other, it's a small pool and word can travel quickly. So if your company is not already a good place for people of color to thrive, you can do all of the recruiting you want. You're going to have a hard time getting people to apply, to go through the process, and to accept the offer, because they're going to hear from a friend. They're going to, find out, right? They're going to ask. I remember when I won't name the law firm, but I was a law firm associate, and they would put me in the interview panels for every single person of color who came through to interview. And depending on the day, depending on my mood, there were times where I literally told candidates, just don't do it. Stop the process, like go somewhere else. Honestly, sometimes if they were law students, I was like, drop out of law school and cut your losses. But just to say that people talk, right? So again, you're wasting your time on the hiring process if you aren't taking care of the people you already have. Another important thing to do when you're thinking about, and I love that Jodi-Ann broke it out, recruiting, hiring, and retention, make sure that you're not staying in silos. These things are all connected. We're talking about these together because it's all connected. So make sure, I know that a lot of companies, you've got your recruiting team and then you've got your HR team or your employee experience team, but make sure that they're talking. You're going to be wasting your recruiter time if HR isn't engaging employees, right? If HR is just dropping the ball and not really figuring out or even running the data on why people of color or women or other groups aren't as engaged, you're going to be wasting your time recruiting if people, like I said, are going to talk and find out that this isn't the place for them anyway. And then secondly, have your recruiters talk to HR too, right? Recruiters get so much information about what candidates are asking for, and that's really powerful. If your recruiters can tell the HR team, like, hey, here's the reason I'm not filling roles, is because all of these candidates are asking me what's up with this or what's up with that. This and that being something problematic around diversity at your company, then that's going to light the fire under HR even more to say, oh shit, we can't sweep that under the rug. We need to address that, right? So it's all connected. Make sure that your HR and your recruiting teams are getting out of silos, talking to each other, listening to candidates, listening to employees. It's all part of the same process. So it's all related. What can we do about it? Jodi-Ann said to take notes. So I think, I'll get some brass tacks right here. We've only got a few minutes. I know we're late. I'll just give you a quick overview of what I think of as the short game, the long game, and the long game. Because, you're not just going to recruit. You're not just going to wake up one day and decide you want a diverse team and have it. So for the short game, I think sweeten the deal. Like, how can you incentivize the people of color already in your company to refer their friends? And particularly if you don't have people of color, or even if you do, like regardless, one thing that I've seen companies do, and I wish I could find the exact statistic, and maybe one of y'all know it, it might have been an Intel or IBM, but a company offered a higher referral bonus if you referred a candidate from a certain underrepresented group. So for example, let's say it's an engineering team. If you refer a candidate who identifies as a woman, instead of getting, let's say, the $500 referral bonus, you're going to get an $800 referral bonus. That was actually enough to move the needle. Whichever company it was, that was the biggest thing that they were able to find to actually build a more diverse team. So test that out. I think get creative, but at the same time, don't tokenize people. So, Jennifer went over it. I think Krystal mentioned it. No one wants to feel like a token, right? No one wants to feel like, oh, I'm just getting in because I'm a person of color, I'm a woman, whatever it might be. Similarly, your employees don't want to waste their time helping your recruiting efforts if they feel like they're going to be a token. At the same time, I think depending on the relationship you have with people, and I've been able in past roles to have this conversation, you can be real with them and you can tell them, hey, we want to hire top talent. That is our goal. That is our responsibility. Like, we're getting fired if we don't hire top talent. And you can say this whether you're a hiring manager, a recruiter, someone on the interview team who's invested in it. And you tell them, we did our research and we know, like I was telling Jodi-Ann, candidates of all demographics are turning down offers at companies without diverse teams. So we know this, we did our research, we care about this, we're doing our best on the engagement side. We would love for you to be on the interview team if you have time. So that's gonna possibly get them in the door, but then the most important thing to do is pay them for their time. So maybe it's a cross-functional interviewer bonus or gift card or extra points on your performance reviews. Recognize that, you know, if you're bringing in the few people of color or women or other groups, other people from marginalized groups into your interview process specifically for this purpose, recognize that they have a full-time job, but they also might be invested in helping, right? They want to have a more diverse company too. But treat them well, recognize their time, pay them, and that might help you in the short game. For the long game, honestly, I'll just, you know, Jennifer handled it. It's all about the employer brand. After you've built a company where people feel like they're supported, get out there and authentically market it. I can skip that because Jennifer covered it. And then for the longer game, you know, that actually reminds me of what Jodi-Ann said about what Zillow is doing in Seattle. Invest in marginalized communities. It's the longer game because you're not hiring someone. Let's say you decide to send dollars and volunteers to Black Girls Code, right? And those are Black girls in middle school who are learning computer science. They're not your candidate pool, but you're building your pipeline for the next 10 years. And then also you're going to retain current talent because current talent is going to see that you're putting your time and your money towards that. And then finally, you're going to have people like Jodi-Ann who are out in the community and who see it. They've already got the skills. They trust that you're putting your time and your resources, you're putting your money where your mouth is about inclusion, and they're more likely to apply, to accept an offer, to tell their friends how great it is. So that's the longer game. So you've got the short game, the long game, the longer game. Hopefully you picked up a few reasons why you can't think of recruitment, hiring, and retention in silos. And then hopefully a few ways that your company can succeed at all three. So thanks so much. I'll hand it back over to Jodi-Ann.
Thank you so much, Kelli. That was incredible. You know, really focusing on taking care of the people that you have. And I love that you emphasize this. Your current employees of color will leave you faster than you can replace them. How can you take care of your current culture? Because it's not just good for employees of color, it's good for everyone. Like you said, there are a lot of white folks who don't want to be in like environments that are all white. They don't want that, right? And so how can we think tactically and actually try to test some things out? Maybe it's an extra referral bonus. I love like acknowledging that maybe for the few folks of color in your company, how can we give them a cross-functional interviewer bonus or acknowledge and recognize their work in stepping outside of their roles to support you in this people function? There might be some folks who don't want to do that, and you have to recognize that. But give people the option who do want to help, who do want to be a part of this, and maybe that's a way where they can meet new people within the company, you know, depending on your structure. And so I just love laying out like the short game, the long game, and the longer game, because when you're invested in this, that's the trajectory. We're thinking about the position that we have open now. We think about, you know, what our attrition might look like in the next year, and we're thinking about our pipeline in 10 years. And so thank you so much, Kelli. So let's transition to the panel. I'd love to hear from Kelli, from Krystal, and from Jennifer. I want to dig into, you know, what are some of the hard truths you think that companies have about the talent pipeline? What are some hard truths that they don't want to hear? What makes them hard to hear? And, you know, what needs to shift to have a change towards racial equity within that talent pipeline process? And so, Kelli, I would love to actually hear from you on this. What are some hard truths you think companies and folks responsible for the talent pipeline find it hard to hear?
Yeah, I mean, I think I covered a lot of it, but I think that a lot of companies, they really just want advice on getting a more diverse candidate pipeline. They want to know, how can I get more women to apply to my tech roles? How can I get more people of color to apply to all my roles? And then maybe they're taking that next step. How can I create an inclusive hiring process, right? Like they're kind of, if you picture it as a funnel, they're saying, okay, we had this many women apply to our tech roles. You know, this many look at our job description. This many, after getting through all of the terrible things we put in our job description, decided to actually bite the bullet and apply. This many passed all of our recruiter biases, got into the interview process, got through the interview process and dealt with it and accepted an offer, right? Like there's this whole funnel. But I think that a lot of companies are so invested in the very top of the funnel. What they don't want to hear, and what makes it hard to hear, is because it's the harder work, right? I can throw dollars at recruiting, and I'll call out Google. This is a stat from, I got into workplace inclusion in like 2012. So this is a statistic from 2012, but it was like Google had like 13% people of color or something, like Black and Latinx people, and they were very proud of it. But then someone inside Google was like, that's a new 13% every year. Because Google has no trouble going to college campuses, going to Morehouse, going to Spelman, and recruiting everyone, right? Like you can throw money at that problem. The thing that's hard to hear is no one wants to stay. Everyone's just either using you for a paycheck and leaving as quickly as they can, and they're not happy. And that's the harder work. But if you really, like getting back to the question, want to shift towards racial equity, you need to do that hard work. You need to make this a place where people are going to want to actually stay. Back to Krystal's analogy, you can't sell people lemons, but people just want to sell lemons. It's easy.
No, I love that. Like thinking about the funnel, there's bias everywhere. So when you get there, I cannot tell you how many folks of color I know that say things like, I'm gonna just put in my 2 years. I'm just gonna put in a couple of years, right? They're not
1 year
excited, like, or 1 year. I've been in places where I'm like, okay, can I last a year? And so Jennifer, I would love to hear from you, what you're thinking around these hard truths about how folks of color are actually experiencing work.
Yeah, I mean, my answer is a lot of +1 to what Kelli said, but something I think a lot about is how underrepresented people, but especially people of color, especially Black people, they are surviving in their organizations right now. They're not thriving. Kelli mentioned earlier, she gets the question a lot, like, oh, how do I hire more women? And I used to get that question so often. I would literally, like one of those things, like if I had a nickel for every time I've gotten that question, I ended up tweeting out, ask not how can I hire more women? Ask instead, how can I build the best inclusive organization that really supports the needs of all underrepresented groups? Because then they'll come banging down your door. It's not just thinking about how do I get people to apply to my jobs. If you invest in things like management training, if you're able to actually build an environment where people will feel supported, every single, let's say, a woman I know who works in a technical role, deals with harassment. Every single Black person I know in every organization deals with microaggressions. And realistically, we're not going to be able to eliminate them overnight. I wish I could. I wish there was a magic button, but there isn't. But in the meantime, what can we do? What can organizations and leaders do to really think about these experiences? I think two things can be true. So one is that, while underrepresented groups have different experiences, and we can solve for that. We can try to make their experiences better, because by doing that, it just makes everybody better. If you build in better training, if you build better managers, then even your white male employees are happy. At the same time, I sometimes think that underrepresented people get kind of alienated in that, they just want to do good work. They're not asking for special treatment. They're literally just I just want to be good at my job, be paid well, do fulfilling, impactful work with people that I respect, just like everybody else. It's just that it's not their fault that we live in a very racist, ableist, sexist society. So within your sphere of influence as an organizational leader, any kind of leader, what can you do in that community? How can you leverage your power to be mindful of that experience? That I really think there's so much room, but it's not going to help if we just keep kind of being fixated on, but how do we get women? How do we get people of color to apply to us?
Yeah, I love that. What is in your sphere of influence and redirecting the focus, right? We just need these people, but to Kelli's point, those people will leave and you'll just replace them with another woman, another Black person. And so I'm curious, Krystal, if you have any hard truths when it comes to this myth around there aren't that many people out there. Right.
Yeah, since I went to church earlier and like got off on a tangent, I'm going to give you the short answer to make sure that there's more time to give the floor to Kelli and Jennifer. But it is a myth, of course. When you look at like the Black community in particular, 13.4% of the United States, and the working Black community, 11%. Okay, I get it, right? Those percentages get smaller and smaller and smaller, but it's no excuse. There's great talent out there in every single demographic, in every single city, in every single business. You need to slow down, look for transferable skills, and remember that at the end of the day, recruiting mostly is a quota-based business in most companies, and look for organizations that have invested in taking the time to woo you and have the conversation. Because if they're taking that time, they are thinking about what's the best candidate, not just what's the fastest best candidate that we can find, right?
Yeah, I love that. Like, can you move at a pace that's within your own integrity around DEI and not just a pace of, I want to fill this role tomorrow? You know, no, I love that. And so I want to shift gears because we're in this moment. We have to acknowledge, you know, this shift, this new, I call it a portal that's been open around this racial reckoning, where previous to this, a couple of months ago, for me to even say racism or white people could be detrimental to my career, my social relationships at work. And now we're in this space where people who previously reprimanded me for that are now out here talking about eradicating white supremacy. And so I have feelings about that, but yes, okay, so now you're on board. Let's talk about eradicating white supremacy. And so I want to talk about, you know, how do you find the balance with your marketing teams, you know, who might support the internal messaging and the external messaging about standing with the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, companies, they want to say something for whatever their reasons are to say something, some authentic, some performative. But for many, doing so, saying something can widen the authenticity gap between who they are internally and their projection of standing with this movement. And so what do those messaging meetings need to actually look like with your marketing team when folks who are on the talent pipeline side of this, right? So you have the marketers and then you have people on the talent pipeline. You know, how do they work together to get a better sense of where the culture actually is, what the data shows, and how to, you know, close that gap between what you say you are and who you actually are. So how do you work with your marketing team on this? Let's see who wants to take that answer. I'm curious, Jen, let's go with you. Yeah.
Well, I was going to share a story. So I mentioned I work with primarily startups, small startups, and this summer was quite the wild ride, where I was talking to a startup founder. You know, they run a 10-person team, and they were telling me, yeah, so, you know, should we put out a statement? We see all these, like, you know, public press releases, all these other CEOs doing it. And I told them, I mean this in the best way possible. Nobody cares. Because you as a 10-person team, the people that really need to hear from you right now are your employees and your immediate communities, your immediate sphere of influence. Once again, I'm going to come back to the Instagram effect that I showed you earlier, which was sometimes what we see as very visible really ends up kind of distorting our views into like, oh, that's what we're supposed to do too, because that's the only example we can see. So when you see like the Apples and the Googles, the big companies putting out statements, it makes us think like, oh my gosh, we should be doing that too, without thinking necessarily about, well, maybe actually, why are we doing this? Who is this serving? Who is going to listen? And if your genuine intention is like, you know, with our privilege and power, we want to be standing in this movement and really put out a statement out there, because that's how we show that we're a company that's going to take a stance. Okay, that's perfectly legit. But unfortunately, sometimes what I very often saw was, I'm very anxious right now with my white guilt, and I feel like I should be doing something. So we should put out a statement. So this motivation is actually very different. And when we talk about performative diversity, your motivation actually matters. If you're not asking the question, why are you doing this? Who is this actually benefiting? You actually run the risk of harming people that when you're actually trying to help. So in this particular case, this person was coming from kind of like an anxious place. I was like, I really should say something, right? And instead, what I kind of coached him towards was, it sounds like the people that actually need to hear from you are your employees. They need to have a human conversation, not one that's necessarily, vetted by, PR agents and that sort of thing. So, we talked about balance. There's the public visible work that, I'm glad it's out there. It helps us all learn. But there is a lot of performative stuff. And what's not visible is the things that happen to us in our immediate circles. And I actually would love for us to have more conversations about what goes on, what are the hard conversations that we need to have. And you might not get credit. You're not going to get internet cookie points for having, a conversation with your 3-person team. Maybe you're the marketing person that, when your CEO, your kind of executive leadership comes in, like, we should put out a statement, and you guide the conversation that actually says, like, actually, maybe that's not the right thing for us to do. You're not going to get credit for that, because now what you did was not say something, but that's actually the right thing to do sometimes.
Yeah, no, I respect that. I think too, in terms of making it not performative, is to make sure you have systems in place where people can be honest about what's actually going on internally and externally, right? Sometimes you don't say anything, but you also have to allow, especially your employees, to be vocal. There are a lot of folks that are being very vocal about what's happening internally at companies right now, which also impacts your messaging. It might be motivating companies to say something if they have bad press about, what's happening internally. And so that makes me think about Julia Bond, who's the assistant apparel designer at Adidas, who's been protesting, some of these microaggressions and things that are happening internally at her company. And so that got covered by the New York Times on their daily podcast. And when I heard it, I was like, oh shit, like, does she still have a job? Right? And so I wonder what could be in place at companies to allow folks of color and their allies to share their grievances about some of these challenges internally or externally without fear of backlash, without fear of that retaliation. And that's the people process, right? That people operations process. And so how can we ensure that folks can speak up about their grievances with racial inequity without being reprimanded for it? Like, what are your thoughts on that? And I would just love to get, kind of quick fire responses so we can transition into some audience Q&A. But I really want to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure, I can share really quickly. I am a big fan of meeting people where they are. And so I think you have to hit it from all angles. And so that's things like a whistleblower line where you can just call in anonymously if you don't know where else to go. We also partner with Bravely, which is an organization that helps to coach people through situations that are coachable, that aren't straight up ethics violations or discrimination. And then of course, like, that's why you invest in a strong HRBP organization. But one of the things I will say for just all of my fellow DEI people out there, when I talk to my peers at other companies, they're one of 2 or one of 4 people doing this work. I'm blessed pre-COVID to have a team of 12 that's only growing. Like, where were these companies investing in the people who could have these conversations last year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, right? Like, I am much better positioned having a large team to be able to hold space, is what we talk about, is holding space, cry together, talk together, and take action. Because I have the manpower, quite honestly, but you have to have the systems and tools for people to also just go anonymously when they don't know someone, they don't trust someone, they don't have the time to build the trust.
Awesome. Any other comments from folks? Nope. All right. So we have 29 questions from people. I tell you right now, it's not going to happen for everyone. I'm sorry. So let's do this round of questioning. We have maybe 5 minutes, and think about your response like a tweet, right? So maybe just a few sentences. There are a lot of questions about wanting to make diversity goals, like hiring more people of color, but without dehumanizing them or tokenizing them. How do you do that? Of having these goals, but you don't want to tokenize people. How do you measure success? Give me a tweet.
So on Twitter, I don't know. I'll just quickly off the top of my head, I think you point to the research and you say, we know that diverse teams outperform financially. They come up with more creative solutions. They're more attractive to candidates of all backgrounds. All of these things matter to our success as a company. And so it's imperative that we bring in more diverse talent, right? Fall back on that, and I think you're not dealing with the quotas. You're not dealing with, oh, you just got hired because you're Black, or you just got hired because you're a woman. It's like, no, I got hired because all y'all are thinking the exact same way, and you need someone to come in here to think differently. Yeah.
No, I love that. Any other tweet responses?
This might be a tweet thread, but I'll make it short. Something I think a lot about diversity and numbers and our focus on it is important. It helps us track kind of progress. But something I think it gets a little bit like distorted that I want to help dispel is that diversity is a result of great people practices. Okay, so if you have, in the most ideal world, we have like really fantastic hiring, management, organizational, HR practices, then we should have pretty equitable and diverse organizations. We don't, which is why we have a lack of diversity problem. So I would love for us to really focus on how do we make better recruiting practices, retention practices? Is there a better way for us to do performance? How can we level up our HR team? That will lead to, over time, diversity. And that's a little bit of tension, because I would also love for some of this stuff to happen faster. But sometimes what I'm afraid that's happening is we just keep trying to fix the numbers without realizing these numbers are a result of this much larger thing. So we don't have to fix it overnight, but I would love for us to actually redirect some of our efforts to what's actually going to be effective, even if it doesn't lead to like immediate results, because by chasing immediate results, that's unfortunately what leads to a little bit of performative diversity.
Yeah. All right, rapid fire. What do you feel are the pros and cons of sharing your representation numbers of your company publicly? Krystal, I know you have something to say because Zillow shares their work and they're a huge company.
And I just refreshed them last week, and there's a lot more coming through the end of the year. So pros, you turn on the lights, it holds you accountable, it holds a mirror up. Not only do your employees know that you're serious about it because you shared it internally, but you shared it externally, so there's no backsies, right? Pros. Cons, you're vulnerable. Like, we've had people say like, oh, there's no leadership of color. Okay, I'll not take offense. I understand I have a Polish last name, like I'm right here. But like where we do have representation, it's not where it should be. You want it to be obvious, right? And so the cons are opening up that wound as you work on it. But it goes round and round. I put that as a pro as well.
Yeah. Any other tweet responses from the panel?
Real quick, pro, data makes this an objective thing that we can no longer deny. So it was actually just a few years ago when companies were refusing to release diversity reports. There were actually lawsuits over this in tech, a little bit of like DEI history there, very recent history. Because back then people were saying like, what are you talking about? Diversity is not a problem. We're a meritocracy. And there were a lot of people trying to prove that like, look, we got to talk about this. And 2014, when Google released their diversity report for the first time, that was a really big freaking deal, because that was the moment upon which we could no longer deny the problem does not exist. The con, or where I would like for us to evolve to next, is, it's been a few years. I think it's time for kind of more sophisticated kind of like analysis of the numbers. It's not just a top level, but, Kelli just mentioned that the 13%, people of color, they were a new 13% every time. Okay, so now our new challenges are around how are these numbers being formed? What do retention numbers look like? What are the strategies that are working, that are not working? I would love to see more of those stories being shared out by companies, not just here's our number, leave us alone.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, last question. Unless, Kelli, did you have something to add?
All good.
Okay, last question. Where do you start? this is a lot. And I think there are folks here that are just like, heck yes, heck yes. Where do you start? And how do you start in this COVID context? I know that's heavy, but I'm curious. What comes top of mind?
First thing that comes to mind to me is you just start. I think a lot of companies get buried into the data, and you're right, Jennifer mentioned like having that data proves a point, right? But you can spend 6 months, you can spend a year collecting data. Guess what? You don't have enough people of color, you don't have enough women, they're under-engaged, they're leaving more quickly. Like, I can tell you, I'll save you the thousands of dollars in a year. So just get started. And if you are coming from, if you are representing a company that has no diversity currently, or let's say an engineering team that has no women, I think you own it. You accept, you recognize it's a problem. Like I gave examples with the short game, long game, get involved in the community, be honest about it, and do the work. Like, stop talking about what we're gonna do it.
Love it. Krystal, Jennifer? Good?
Yeah, just I will say +1 to do the work. And there's kind of different spheres we could do that. So there's company-wide, there's team-wide as a leader, but there's also just like the individual. You know, I think there's so many great resources out there. Like, truly, like, there's infinite number of books you can read, podcasts you can listen to, whatever helps you to work for your own feelings. All of us have grown up in a white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist society where a lot of thoughts that we hold really closely, it's you know, you've heard the term unconscious bias because they're unconscious. And doing this work, engaging with this work, for all of us, it's going to bring up sometimes really tough feelings. It's going to bring a lot of discomfort. It's going to bring a lot of shame. And creating space that for yourself, it might literally just like sit in your room for 30 minutes and think about it.
Yeah.
That's actually a really important part of the work too.
Love it. Thank you so much. I want to see a lot of praise in the chat for all of our panelists for sharing today. I will hand it over to Akin to give our last comments about what you can do next.
Thank you, Jodi-Ann. And I'm blown away. This was an amazing, amazing conversation. Thank you to Jennifer, Krystal, and Kelli. And the call to action here, I know we're running out of time, is I'll be doing this, and I encourage you all to do this. By the way, I'm Akin Yashin. I'm the director of the graduate program Communication Leadership at the University of Washington, one of the partners of this event, is to bring back questions from this session to your teams and to identify your next steps. That's where Jodi-Ann ended. I've already identified the questions that I'll start with, where we can make actionable items. And I encourage you all to do that. Tag all of the speakers and all of us in your conversations so that we can bring back to this diverse global audiences, networks, and micro and macrocosms our conversations and make actionable next steps a reality. We really hope for that. So I'll be doing that right after this session. And one more quick reminder that we have one more session next week, and we'll be talking, building on this conversation again with Jodi-Ann, but this time talking about building an anti-racism toolkit for marketing and communications, which is very much, again, touched upon today, but we'll continue the conversation next week. Joined by Aubrey Blanche, Tina Mary Gully, and Folayo Lasaki. We'll be sharing their bios and information. They're amazing, but our speakers today were also outstanding and amazing. So I thank you all, and I appreciate you all, and I wish you everyone a great week, and we hope to see you next week as well. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for our interpreters. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, everybody.